Good afternoon. Welcome once more at 4 p.m. on a Wednesday to another episode 19, I think we're at. Might even be 20. I'll check at the end. Episode well through into the series anyway of the series where we connect with old boys. Thank you to the people who are joining now and find out what they've been up to since leaving Quegs. Now, my guest this afternoon, I'm delighted to say, is a former, just invited him there, called Harry Crowson, who's been on an interesting journey in the 10-some years since he left Quegs. I think we'll get him to confirm it, I think he's a 2013 or 2014 leaver. And he's going to tell us about what he's been up to at university, and then since that, and it's a very interesting story, and I think there are some really interesting points that will come out of it. He studied A-levels in maths, further maths and physics, and went on to study astrophysics at university. And I'm filling, as I always do, because he hasn't joined us yet. Let me see if I can have another go. Oh, in fact, here he is. That's perfect.
Hi.
I'm going to invite you again, but we've got him, and it's a very nice tie you're wearing there, sir. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
It seemed like the right one to wear today.
I've got my one with the little school badges on, so we're both all savved up, and it's great to have you here. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
I know you're a busy man, and you've got a lot going on, which we'll explore in a moment. But for you to spare us the time this afternoon to catch up is absolutely brilliant. So thank you. I was just saying to those that are joining, and there are plenty joining, you did A-levels in maths, further maths and physics, and then went off to do astrophysics at university. And why don't you take up the story from there? What's happened from then to now?
Well, exactly the opposite of what you'd expect, I suppose, is the honest answer there. Completely maths and physics based, and essentially avoided anything where there wasn't a definite answer. I hated the idea of taking an exam and someone telling me I'd interpreted it the wrong way and written stuff, so I ignored them all.
Yeah.
Study physics with the intention of, I wasn't really sure, I don't think anybody really is, but with the intention and hope of maybe using that someday. By the time of the end of my second year, so about the time when you're committed to finishing it, as opposed to training, it became obvious that whilst I was studying something I wanted and I found interesting, it really wasn't what I wanted to do as a job. And so ended up looking towards law, which is something I'd completely ignored because I'd had family who did as they often do, say, "Oh, you don't want to do what I do."
Don't do my job. Yeah,
it's exactly. Boring. It's awful. You'd hate it, and I believed it, and only then sort of turned my eye back to it. And even though it was a complete about turn, sort of opened that door. And thankfully, the qualifications and pathways exist for you to convert a degree into pretty much anything. And thankfully, if you've got a bachelor's in anything, you can, strangely enough, convert it into a law degree, which is what I decided to do. And thankfully, I was able to do it.
And I think that's really interesting. I think that's something that perhaps people don't understand. Some of the people watching, you think, I want to be a lawyer, or maybe you don't think that even when you're still at school, but that comes later. But you don't actually have to do a law degree. It's a route that some people do, and it's the right route for some. But that's a very interesting point, and I think probably not necessarily well understood that, as you said, whatever degree you come through with, the conversion route exists to end up getting trained as a lawyer. So you decided to do that. And can I just say, I absolutely recognise and empathise with that. Those are the same A-levels I did, and I was also the same as I've lived through my life. But I was also the same. If it's not a definite answer, I don't really want to get into a debate. And as you say, get told you've interpreted something wrong. So that really resonates with me as well. So then you did in fact go into a discipline where there isn't always a right answer. So tell us about that journey.
I told 16, or even asked a sort of 16-year-old me about the concept of speaking in public for a living. I must admit, I probably wasn't considered very sociable. I think that's probably fair to say. And I did it once as part of a school assembly and was trembling all the way through. So if you told 16-year-old me the concept of doing that as a job, you'd have got a very scared answer.
Yeah.
The way I changed in that I still like all the same things I liked and still sort of learn in the same way. but I got into it through realizing I'd been a bit ignorant of it, ignoring the idea of getting into law because I'd been told you'll hate it, it's boring, and probably coming up with an image of utter boredom and sifting through papers 24/7. When I finally opened the door to potentially looking at it, it became obvious that actually it's the sort of thing I could get on board with. And I think 16 to, 27, so 10 years of change, I actually quite like speaking in public now. And it's something I find quite engaging and quite rewarding about the job.
That's brilliant. So take us through, is it a 1-year course, a 2-year course? What's the sort of mechanics of, you've qualified in astrophysics. So what happens next?
So when you have done a bachelor's or a degree in anything, if you apply, I think the requirement at the time that I did it was you had to get a 2-2.
Yeah.
With the exception of you having got a 2-2, it was simply a case of you applying and making sure that you had all the qualifications in place. But they were, as far as I'm aware, just a bachelor's and a 2-2, and then you're straight on the law degree, which is a single year, albeit you can't. I think there are provisions for you to do part-time.
Yeah.
Well, essentially, if you're full-time working and you want to do the course alongside that work, there are some people who decide to do the conversion much later in life because they are, they have families and they want to start a law career. But essentially, there's provisions to do it part-time. I did it full-time and did it all in 1 year. And then I did the bar course, which gets all manner of different acronyms depending on when they change the name. But essentially, the bar course is the same. I did it in 1 year as a full-time student. But again, you can do it part-time. So mine were 2 years to go from BSc in physics to qualified as a barrister, which... And
that's what you mean when you say the bar course. So, and what's the difference between a solicitor and a barrister, let's say, for those who are not clear? I think I know, but clarify it for me for everyone else watching as well.
So barrister and solicitor, at least in the realm I work in criminal law. If you got if you were nicked for a crime and taken to a police station to be interviewed, you'd ask for a solicitor, and they'd be there. Once the case, if the case is proceeding, the solicitor would handle your file. They'd still advise you. They'd represent you in the magistrate's court for a while, but in the event it was going to be a trial,
right,
or at a Crown Court, you tend to get a barrister involved, which is where I sort of take over for the questioning of witnesses, handling of the case, speeches in the event it's going to be a jury trial, things like that.
And so that's your job day to day. So what does a typical day look like? Do you mind telling us sort of, a recent day, or just the sorts of things that a barrister does?
Well, so my week has been pretty variable. Even this week, this Monday I was in York, which I suppose is another aspect, which is I work all over the place.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Representing a Vietnamese lad who'd been trafficked to the UK and was being made to be part of a cannabis farm, growing cannabis for an organised crime group. The last couple of days, I've been involved in a firearms case for a shooting that took place near Bradford.
Wow.
It's not always trials. You don't get to just do trial after trial after trial. There's loads of interim hearings that are far less engaging. But the work is about as variable as you want it to be. I work anywhere in crime, and I'm happy to take on whatever the cases are. But it can lead to you doing different things day to day, unless it's sort of a lengthy trial that occupies your whole week. And
so how long exactly have you been doing that? That's 4 years, is that? Am I summed right there?
Best part of 4 years, yes. So
yeah.
I'm fully qualified and fully on my own 2 feet, as it were, for about three some years. But I've been, after qualifying, it's been about 4 years.
Right, brilliant. And so you've gone into specialising, is that the right term? I suppose more criminal law than anything else. And,
yeah.
And what's the sort of pathway into that? Is that something that you got in because you're interested, or that's where the opportunities were? How does that work?
And it's a little bit sometimes in that beggars can't be choosers, so that when you qualify as a barrister, that it is quite competitive to try and get into what's called a barrister's chambers, which is where one have to be part of one in order to be a qualified barrister and in order to do the job. They're really competitive, and there's loads of applications. And so in the event you're going to get into one, it sort of depends on the work they do. Mine do a lot of criminal work, a lot of family work, a lot of civil work and things like that. But it's a matter of where you apply. So some barristers' chambers set up with the idea of doing a lot of land law and patent law and things that I'm already boring enough by the sound of what I talk about, and I like to think at least it's more entertaining than that.
Yeah. So, but that, as you say, sometimes it's to do with where you end up working as to what they're specialising in.
Yeah.
So, fantastic. I've never been to a trial. Describe your process for being in a trial. I presume you've done some interesting ones. Perhaps have you done some that presumably the media are covering them that high interest? Have you? And
Yeah,
if you can tell us about them.
The media tend to cover the ones that have a bit of nitty gritty in them. So you'll get a lot of tabloid interest whenever there's something that's particularly violent or particularly unpleasant. Media tend to focus on, and I won't claim to have ever been part of these, if there is a trial ongoing, they tend to focus on the biggest one taking place, so the murder trials, the terrorism trials. So I can't claim to have had media clamoring anywhere near any of mine. I'm not quite at that level yet.
No.
Your average trial depends a lot on terms of how complicated it is, but the general gist of it, depending on which side of the bench I'm on, prosecuting or defending, is the defence, if they are having a trial, prosecution open the case, which basically gives the jury a gist of what the case is going to be. Prosecution call all of their evidence, either by witnesses or by reading it out or by playing footage, or calling scientists if there's that sort of evidence involved.
This is the exhibit B you're on a kind of moment.
Yeah.
Right.
And then when prosecution is done and sit down and are happy they've called all their evidence, it flips over to the defence. The defendant or any witnesses bring and give evidence. And then you get the bits that are probably more associated with being a barrister, where two people in wigs and gowns prostrate themselves before the jury to try and convince them that they're right, that the prosecution are absolutely right and the defendant's awful, or the defendant's not so bad and is in fact not.
And you said which side you're on. How is that determined? Do you get a choice in that, or are you assigned because that's what you've been retained, the company's been retained, or how does that work?
So
I am quite ignorant on this, so these are genuine questions as well. But I think that they're interesting for everyone watching as well, because I don't know how well this is generally understood. So please enlighten us as much as you can.
I do both because I sort of want to do both. But again, I think certainly you'd have to be doing it for a lot longer than me before you can get enough work to just choose which one. So I take the work as it comes to me, and that comes sometimes from the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, come to the chambers and say, we have a burglary case and we need someone to prosecute it. Similarly, solicitors contact the chambers to say, we have somebody who's accused of a burglary and we want somebody to defend it. If I'm available, if I'm able to do it, if it's the sort of case I can handle, because there's various cases that I'm just not experienced enough to do yet. If somebody said, can you prosecute a terrorism conspiracy? No, not yet, sorry.
Oh, okay. The experience comes into it as well, because and so while the trial's on, I'm guessing there's a lot of reading, a lot of research, a lot of knowing the law, but also checking and double checking. Do you do that on your own? Have you got a team? How is?
No, well, there are. You tend to have some people supporting you. So if you're prosecuting, there'll be often a paralegal to help you sort of sift through documents and things. And if you're defending, it'll be the solicitor who helps you out with that. But for the vast majority of cases, you don't get huge amounts of support. The case is yours and you handle it. And one of the things that it tends to be strange for a jury is that we don't actually sit very long in court. Court days tend to be from about 10:30 to maybe 3:30, 4 o'clock, which on the one hand feels like we're not getting much done in a day, particularly if you've got a lunch break. But of course, before that and after that and in the evenings, if the trial's ongoing, there's loads to sort out. And so if you clocked off at 5:30, you'd be working, sleeping, waking up, working and cracking on again. So it's designed to sort of let us try and sift and sort the bits around.
Yeah. And trials vary in length, I guess. Some are over in a day, some last a long time, dependent on the amount of evidence. And so what's typical, if that's such a question, or maybe the other way is what's the longest you've done? Think of it that way.
The longest I've been involved in, and I think these tend to be one of the longer types of cases, a fraud case. I was involved in one that was listed for nearly 3 months.
Oh,
just
wow.
sheer amount of documents and everything. Honestly, that you have sympathy for members of the jury who are called in intending to, here I am to do my jury service. I wonder who I'm going to prosecute. And you go, ladies and gentlemen, this is a tax fraud, and it's going to take 12 weeks.
Yeah, and then yeah, exactly. That's not what I thought I was getting. Okay,
No,
but the jury needs to be there and needs to hear the evidence. And
yeah.
Oh wow. Well, thank you. That's hugely enlightening in terms of unlocking a process, and it you know, people, I guess, I mean, we talked about it. People have an idea of what happens in court, probably because they've seen it on TV, they've seen dramatizations of it. Is it like that, or is that just? Is it anything like that, or is
there's bits that certainly are in keeping with it. There's bits that are a bit strange to see. The whole objection thing, yeah, I get the impression is much more an American thing than it is for us. I've never seen.
You've never had to shout "Objection, Your Honour" in court, no.
No, the weird language, the sort of old Victorian language, is still a bit of a thing. Sort of open cases with, well, for instance, if I was the first person to speak in a Crown Court case, first words always out of your mouth are "May it please Your Honour," which is a really strange sentence no one else would ever say.
But that's what's done.
The vast majority of it is essentially what you would expect. And actually, I suppose I should say, there are public galleries in every single courtroom. The whole court process is open if anybody wants to go and find out. Have you used the Chewbacca defence yet, says Rory Bramley. Thanks very much.
I don't know what that is, but
I've been knocked off my train of thought because I'm trying to work out what that is.
Maybe he'll explain it to us later. Thanks, Rory. Shut up now. We're talking. Sorry, you were saying the public galleries are available.
Yeah. So, but in terms of what you'd expect to see, I think there are rules of evidence that you are forbidden from doing that if I watched a TV show would probably pick up on. For instance, if you are questioning your own witness, you are absolutely prevented from leading them to a particular answer. Easy example would be if I'm trying to get information out of you, I'm not allowed to say, "This is the case, isn't it?" Because your answer would just be yes or no. And actually, you haven't given evidence. I've just told you what to say, and you've said yes.
Exactly.
There are particular rules about it like that. But the vast majority of it is two barristers get a chance at each witness. If it's a prosecution witness, and if I were the prosecutor, I ask all the questions I can to get as much detail and evidence I can out of the crime, and then the barrister has a go to try and nitpick, poke holes, and try and undermine that story. And similar around, if the defendant's given evidence, their barrister will try and ask all the questions to try and make them sound as credible and as honest and give their story as clearly as possible. Then prosecution barrister has a good go at trying to find the holes and point out the lies.
Brilliant. Thank you. So in a more general sense, so that's where we are now, and we'll talk about the future in it, but can we look back a bit? Thinking back to your time at school, I mean, you mentioned you thought you were going to be a physicist, or you thought you were going to do physics. Now, we did further maths together, and that was definitely the direction of travel. But that wasn't to be. What else, when you think back to your time at school, what else jumps out to you? What memories do you have? What do you associate with your time at school particularly?
I played quite a lot of rugby at school. I was never fantastic at it, but it particularly at Queggs, I suppose it's getting involved in rugby. I think even
it's one of the things we do. Yeah.
Way down to, I think there were F team back when you were in junior school, so everybody's in to have a go. In terms of things I remember from school, I can't say that much stood out in the way of hobbies, because I don't think I got involved in many other clubs other than playing sport and doing my subjects. I'm afraid my answer is going to be a bit
fair enough.
Quite no, everybody else. No, everybody did.
And have you any poignant memories of your time in school? Anything that jumps out? Any particular incidents, any funny incidents, or happy or sad? What sort of things?
Well, one of the things I think probably kick-started me being here is I got in touch with Al Rees, who was at the time with head of sixth form. I think he might still be.
He still is. Yeah, he still is. Yeah.
I got in touch actually because I lost my mum when I was at school and I knew at the time that the school were really good about it, and teachers were fantastic at being supportive, and I knew sort of the undercurrent that people were aware, but not sort of overly so, and it wasn't overbearing. But I think one of the things I and I think I must say it's in the past that you appreciate it, how much was going on behind the scenes, because I know sort of thinking in the past what things were clearly going on, and the sort of allowances that were being made for me, and the watchful eyes that were there to make sure I was doing okay, which I must say I probably didn't notice or appreciate when I was 17, but given 10 years and thinking back, you think actually there were people really there for me.
Yeah.
Probably got more support than I would have done in another school where the class sizes are much bigger, and schools has a tendency that it might not have been picked up in the way it was.
And that's, you know, that's lovely to hear you say that. And I think it is something we work very hard at, is to look after our own and make sure that we've got people's backs. And sometimes it is from a distance. It's not, you know, necessarily all about being in people's faces or you know, talking about it even. It's just, you know, looking out for the boys that need it when they need it. And, you know, at that time, that was definitely what you needed. And, you know, it's lovely to hear you say that. And I'm glad that was the case. And Mr. Rees, you know, he won't mind me saying he was very touched to get your letter and to hear that. And, you know, and I say that probably indirectly has led you to us sitting here today, because that was the, you know, oh, what's he up to? Oh, well, really? Is he? Wow, that's an interesting story. And it is an interesting story, because I think one of the things, and we've talked about this already when we talked before, I think when you're at school, sometimes it's easy to think, oh, well, I'm going to be this, or I'm going to go to this route, and to set your mind on something or set your heart on something. But in fact, you know, more and more as we've heard these stories on a Wednesday afternoon, that's, you know, people are not where they thought they were going to be at all. And that's okay. You know, that's absolutely fine, because that's actually how the world of work works. And you know, that one direction you can pivot to another direction. Your experiences in one area, I mean, it's quite interesting. You said there that the advantage of having a different degree sometimes to come into the law gives you a different perspective, and you're learning from a different angle. So I think there are lots of, you know, really, really important points and really important things for people to pick up from there. What are you most proud of, would you say, since leaving school? What are the standout moments in your life so far? You're not very old, of course. You've got a lot of living still to do. But what in the 10 or so years, what are the high points, would you say?
Well, I was pleased to be able to sort of jump from one to the other in a relatively short space of time. Helped and supported quite a lot in being able to do the courses on a full-time basis rather than needing to work a lot. I think I've done quite a lot in the last few years that I'm quite proud of work-wise. There are some pretty rewarding moments spending in that if you genuinely get a really good result for somebody, that can be quite rewarding. I think in a strange sort of way, the bits that are even more satisfying are when I've prosecuted certain people who have done either very abusive or very violent things to quite vulnerable people who in ordinary circumstances have felt a bit powerless. Quite cathartic and quite rewarding to be able to pick up the case on their behalf and prosecute the person who's done awful things to them. Give them a bit of taste of their own medicine, make them squirm, and have them found guilty. Prove that actually, you know, and thankfully we can sort of get the person who's done something awful to you. And I think particularly for me, without giving specific detail, there are memories and instances of not just violence, but sort of domestic violence, where people take a particular advantage of a relationship or something like that, where it has been very satisfying and very rewarding to bring them to just.
Yeah. No, I can imagine that. Are you young to be a barrister? I don't mean that in a disparaging or disrespectful. I don't know what the sort of typical age profile is. You know.
Well, it's one of those jobs that people tend to, if they stay in, can stay in all the way through. There are degrees of progression by sort of reputation and grade, where, you know, I've said I wouldn't be able to just pick up a terrorism trial because I'm not an experienced enough barrister, that sort of thing. But the lower end, I think the youngest you could possibly be and be qualified and on your feet is about 24, just to have done. Okay. Yeah. I'm 27, so I've been in it about 3 years. So I started about as young as you can. But people converted at all manner of different stages of life. Are barristers who are still practicing who are in their 70s, because I don't know why they wouldn't retire, but
but they haven't. Yeah,
Yeah, there's a huge range in age, and it tends to go by seniority. In that the older you are, the longer you've been at it, and therefore the more stuff you're doing. But it's not a blanket rule.
No, and you've already mentioned experience is a big part of it. Knowing
Yeah.
things and learning and as it is in many professions, experience is important in terms of the wisdom and the sort of the gravitas you bring to it. Absolutely. What was I going to ask? You mentioned the different grades. What's the sort of possible progression? Have you got ideas about that? You are young.
Well,
where do you see the future maybe shape up? Of course, if I'd asked you this 10 years ago, you wouldn't have said I'm going to be a barrister. So it might not be that it pans out this way. But what at the moment are your kind of ideas for?
I think I'm going to stay in this job. I like it until I retire, until I stop. Which is kind of nice to think now, having done a complete 180.
Yeah.
Progression is sort of laid out in front of you for this, in that you do different things every day. But the reason I say grade is because as a prosecutor, you get a grade anywhere from 1 till 4. I'm grade 2.
Right.
The details of what they mean, but you can probably determine a grade 4 is able to do murders, terrorism, all of the worst. You can probably then put into your head where sort of different offences will fit.
Mm-hmm.
The older you get, more experience you get, the higher your grade can go. And the sort of wider your practice goes and the more serious cases you can take on. At the very, very top, you can be made what's called King's Counsel, which is basically been experienced enough and you have a sufficient reputation. You're appointed to a sort of special level, essentially. Where you are appointed, well, now by the king. It was once Queen's Counsel, but
Counsel
now
previously,
or you can the pathway, which is to try and become a judge, which is when you've got experience and there's sort of exams and stuff and various interview processes, but you can become a part-time judge and then decide to sit full-time instead.
And is that something that might interest you one day?
Yeah, well, I quite like the idea. I'm a good few years away from being able to properly apply, less being able to sit as one. But I think honestly, if I'm ever good enough and experienced enough, I think yes, I would like to look at it. And it's quite nice to sort of have the two different pathways laid out of stay in the job I'm doing and just more and more serious, more and more experienced. And in the event I want to look at being a judge, I can see if I'm good enough for it.
Brilliant. I wanted to ask about when you meet a client, whether if you're defending someone who's accused of something.
Yeah.
Your job is to make the case. Your job is not to find them guilty. That's the jury's job. So, does that present ethical challenges for you if you think they are guilty, or where does that sit? I guess you get asked this because this is one of the questions, isn't it?
Well, I think this is probably one of the mysteries, and one of the bits that can probably dispel it is if I think the evidence is overwhelming, or I think they're probably going to be found guilty. That's my advice, because my job is to help them as much as I can. So that isn't saying let's have your trial. Sometimes that is saying I think if you have your trial, you'll lose, and then you'll have a bigger sentence. So part of my job is to drag them into a room and tell them what.
Yeah.
No,
what you think, likelihood, yeah.
Yeah, and well, I've heard that, but I want my trial. Fine, have your trial. There's also, I suppose, the inevitable follow-on from that, which is the question: what do you do if your client tells you they're guilty? You tell them to plead guilty, or they get another barrister. Is the effective answer?
That is what happens. Yeah.
There are caveats to it. There are some exceptions, but the general rule is, if my client says yes, I did it, but try and get me off, like it's a US courtroom drama, the answer is no. You've told me I have a duty not to lie, because I can't use lies, I can't use deceit. It doesn't work like that. No. My advice is to plead guilty, and if they want a trial, you use the phrase, if anybody ever does go into a courtroom and hear it, the phrase is professionally embarrassed.
Okay.
Basically, which is basically a roundabout way of not saying what you need to say, which is, but I can't represent him because he's told me he did it.
Well.
And he finds another barrister and probably has learned his lesson and doesn't tell that one he did it, or he decided.
Yeah, wow. So that's quite difficult, but there are rules and there is support for governing how that's dealt with, as you would expect. But yes, I say one of the mysteries. I think that's I know I've heard that discussed before, but thank you for sharing that with us, because I think that's again very enlightening. What else do we need to talk about? So I ask everyone this: if you're thinking about, no, you weren't thinking about the law in school, but we have boys that are, and there would be girls watching as well from the girls' school, I'm sure. And what advice would you give someone who is or isn't thinking about being a lawyer or being a lawyer, or working in the law, or being a barrister, or a solicitor, or all the different pathways that there are into the legal career? What advice would you say to someone at school that they should be focusing on, thinking about doing? Particularly if I already know that I want to do that, what should I be thinking about from your position?
I think if you're in any mystery, go and see it, because that was the mistake I made. I grew up being told you'd hate this, and then finally opened the door, I realised I don't think I would actually. This sounds exactly my sort of job. But if you are in any doubt, there's public galleries all over the place. Go and see them.
That's pretty good advice.
If you want anything to do with it, and if you look at it and think, God, that looks awful, well, there's your decision. But in terms of if you were trying to go down that pathway, it is really competitive. And sort of when you get to the application stages, you end up in the frustrating position where everybody's got the same qualifications. Everybody's probably got the same grades in them, or really close. Putting on their CV, I really want to do this, and here are my excellent grades. I think one of the best pieces of advice you can give, not just for this, but to anything, is to try and create yourself into a well-rounded person who you might be able to say more than I'm really good at exams and I want to do this job. Because it's such a competitive world, and if you end up in an application sift where you sound no different from everyone else, you end up never getting your chance to say your piece and never actually getting into the interview room, because you sound like everybody else and you don't stand out.
I agree. That's not just this discipline. It's all discipline. What are you bringing? In the end, you're going to be working with people. So, what are you bringing to that team? How are they going to be able to work with you? What are you offering that someone else isn't? I think that's a really important point.
In the accidental way, my weird progression, I think, probably helped, because at least it invited a question as to say, how on earth did you get what?
How does an astrophysicist end up?
Why did you get?
Yeah.
What use is that to you? And even then, it's just made it linger. But even if that's a case of filling your time with other stuff and making yourself interesting in other ways, I don't think that's to my job in any way, shape, or form. I think that's a case of, particularly when you're in an environment like Quasar, if you're going to a competitive profession, everybody's really good.
So get used to it and find your thing, find your way to excel. I think that's really good advice. You mentioned an application sift. So are you involved in hiring and firing at any stage? Is that been something you've been part of, or will be in the future?
I have been recently in them. So I got involved in, literally the application sift. I've not been part of the interview panels yet, but it was strange to get involved in it, having applied only about 4 or 5 years earlier, and to how many applications you end up through, and you end sort of out of necessity having to be quick, because you get given however many applications and you've got to decide pretty quickly 5 of them that you're actually going to spend any time.
Best 5, yeah.
You don't get very much time to do it, and it's a bit shocking how callous and cold it becomes, where you think, wow, each and every one of these people has something to say, and I'm required to dispense with them, decide who sit through, and it is a bit scary, and it feels a bit callous sometimes.
Yeah, and I guess that's true in other disciplines as well, but the more competitive things are, the more somehow you've got to stand out, somehow you've got to bring something either excellent or different or both. Yeah, really. I mean, you mentioned, I think, that people with personality, people with flair. What do you mean by that? What can I put on an application form that's going to make you interested in meeting me? What sort of things do stand out for you, or have you got any examples of things that have worked in the past, if you like, or that you know?
I can tell you the example from my interview. which is that I think with the intent of trying to make me and the other applicants think of something to say where there wasn't any redeeming qualities. I think what we were trying to do was set us up to say, you pull out something positive to say.
Yeah.
And so my application, because I applied in 2016, 2017. In any event, the important point is Donald Trump was the president of the United States at the time.
Yeah.
My last interview question was, "You are Donald Trump's press secretary, convinced going to be the best president that's ever sat in the Oval Office."
Argue the case, yeah.
So and I'm not going to do it, so please don't ask me. I gave my answer, but I gave it in a Southern American accent, which was utterly offensive and totally out of the realms of. But it made them. I don't think they actually heard my answer.
Right.
You know what? You silly questions. So I'm going to answer it in a silly way.
Sometimes you have to take a chance and do it. Yeah, interesting. Thank you. So I say this every week. 36 minutes has gone in the blink of an eye. We're still talking, and I could talk to you all afternoon. But I know we've got things to do. But a couple more questions about school, if you will. Have you got any? If you want to give a shout out to any particular teachers, we've already talked about Mr. Rees, and that's lovely. Or any trips that you did, or anything that you look back on with particular fondness and happy memories.
Well, there are quite a lot of teachers who I think of really fondly. I know I've already mentioned Mr. Rees, and I, with our further maths class being as tiny as it was, quite intense and really quite fun, because there were only, I think, about 11 of us in the classroom or something like that.
Yeah.
I had, when I went into school, actually, while I was sitting with Al, I had both Dr. Clark and Mr. McWilliam walk by me and recognise me, which I really didn't expect, given that I don't think I look anything like the way I did it. Glasses, beard, and I think my hair colour's changed since. When you sent me the list of questions about, is there any teachers with particular fondness or otherwise, and I must confess that the or otherwise sent shockwaves through my brain of Mr. Parsons, who but I think we all did. I think that was his way.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. And okay, final question. If you could go back in time and tap young Harry on the shoulder and give him a piece of advice, knowing now what you didn't know then, what would you say? What would you tell him to watch out for or to do?
I don't think I'd tell me to. I'd be scared of scaring me. I don't think I'd tell me to do anything differently in terms of my qualifications, because I enjoyed my time at uni, even though it wasn't what I wanted to do out of a job. And I think the doing a different degree and then converting, as I think I mentioned before, kind of helps. And there's quite a few people who go that way with it, and I think profit from it rather than spend just focusing on one course. I think one thing I think I mentioned this when you sent me the question. You said, what do I wish somebody had told me? I think one thing that got into my head was I lost perspective on how competitive Quakes can be. So you end up in this environment I've just mentioned, further maths, which by its very nature is the 11 boys in the school in that year who really like maths.
Yeah.
Annoyed at myself being not the top of that class.
Yeah.
I think sometimes at least I could have done with a reminder, and I think probably a few people can, of saying, just a bit of perspective. You're in a bit fee-paying, really good grammar school. The idea of coming third is actually okay.
That's okay, yeah. That's still pretty good.
On the one hand, being competitive is great, but on the other, you think, don't lose perspective of where you sat. Because I remember actually when we started further maths, we created this idea of see if you can get 100%, see if you can get 100 in any of the modules. And I still remember really vividly getting C1 back, and it was 96, and I was livid with myself.
I know.
Which
amazing result, and you're gutted.
Yeah. Hindsight, I think that's a bit unfair. 96 is all right, but it's something I occasionally could have tapped and said, "You're doing all right."
Relax, please. It's good. It's all good. Yeah, I think that's brilliant. Harry, thank you so much for joining us. I know you've recently got married. Congratulations. I know that you've got a young one on the way in the near future, and I wish you all the best for that wonderful, mad, crazy experience that's ahead of you. We did it 7 years ago and we're still loving it. But yeah, all the best for that. Please do keep in touch. I know you're busy, but you're very welcome to come into school anytime. I'm sure there will be lines of boys who'd want to ask you questions and talk to you. And if you're able to do that, we're always looking for mentors. I think you may have already signed up for that, but thank you again. Yeah, I was told earlier in the afternoon, try and sign you up to be a mentor for astrophysics. So if someone contacts you about would you be a mentor and talk to people about physics, then that's where that's coming from. Even you know you not end up in physics, you know what the course is about.
Do it.
Yeah, do it and then do something else. Exactly. Thank you ever so much. Really, really grateful, and good luck with everything. Keep in touch, and we'll look forward to following your career through the ranks of being a barrister, being a success, and one day maybe even being a judge. Who knows? But it's been a real pleasure, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks. Great to speak.
Harry Crowson, thank you. Bye bye.
I'll see.